by noon. Very, very simple. It's just we're going to have coordinated elections at the.
Yeah. I did last night. The summary. I'm just assuming this is right.
Yeah,
okay.
and the typewriter.
I can't anticipate not liking. I did send back that recycled water pilot. There was one sentence in there that wasn't a sentence too.
Recycled.
Oh yeah, no, that is true.
Okay, I just thought that's true.
Which recycled water?
The Cinema Water Agency one that we had.
That's a very good attitude. It's crazy.
No, I was still sitting on my desk, so I just sent it out yesterday. I thought they were going to rewrite it, so I just tried to rewrite it ineptly, but.
Sure.
Oh, okay.
But you sent a rewrite?
I just sent some thoughts, so you can ignore them. But there was one sentence that I read it twice and it wasn't a sentence. It might really be a sentence if I looked at it a third time, but the fact that I had to do that suggests that it was, and it was just too long to make the point. It was like another thing, another thing, another thing. So you could take out the stuff that bugged me in it when you come out.
These microphones that are on.
Here's what we're doing. There's a lot of pieces.
Well, the people here like it. I was somewhere, I won't mention it.
He's going to see what?
I used to stay there.
Our entries?
Writing everybody's stuff.
No, these are, we're just filling in. Those are, I think, those are mostly just mine and one of Max's. They just haven't completed the others yet.
Yeah.
They're working on them.
But he wants to know.
Here's my
He
sort
will
of thoughts or outline on the
our submittal to the other.
on me.
Eight to
Back
the others.
some of them back.
Today.
So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Just to see if it makes sense.
I assume by 5.
No, I just want to know.
When we met yesterday, they were going to try to have them done by noon today. So there's only one, on the other agency stuff in here.
Pam's watching on the web. She says,
This one will go other agency, that's DWR, DWR.
I could really try to mess with that, but that would be inappropriate. They should
By the way, if DWR has any authority or responsibility for reviewing groundwater management plans?
Well, only in as much as they have to make sure that the required elements are there to get funded. Because the 30-year plans are linked to funding now through a subsequent bill. And so they have to make sure that the required elements are there. All the required elements are.
Yeah, I know, but we're saying that we're going to take on responsibility to bring other further actions needed.
Well,
So, but without even mentioning that a power plant.
well, yeah.
No,
Understood.
I could just see what they think of that. Since they're the only one in statute that actually mentioned that.
Yeah, I mean, we were going to determine whether or not like base management objectives are there, you know, that are specific to,
In other words, but things that aren't required.
Perfect.
But that we think.
yeah. So, for example, groundwater management plans, we have to have basin management objectives, but it doesn't say.
It could be a good thing. We are going to get ourselves in trouble.
You know, it all seems milk toast to me.
Oh, I know, but asserting that we're going to go out and review all the services and decide whether or not they're adequate, or at least going to hire them.
Oh, it's a problem that's kind of attached to it's not a problem. This is the problem our solutions. So this is what we Sure, of course.
Yeah, I think here's so we would not have a chance to change and I just gotta get that out there. So I was trying to get it work. So I'm asking for a little part.
That makes sense. I should make the same offer.
hey guys.
Yeah, and then I take over from
Yeah,
there.
you're right. So, but I think it sounds wonderful, you know, I mean, it's a great story. Yeah, it's a great story.
Thanks. Appreciate you trying.
Oh, I'd love to see it, yeah, I just actually went a couple weeks ago.
Oh, hi, Rob. The thing is coming. Come down here.
Oh, we're here.
But,
Here we are.
yeah, right. But, yeah.
And Mel, I think it might be good to give people a little more time than we've given them because they have to comment on different things. What would be, try an extra 5 and then not on the panels and not go hog wild. All right. Do you need, oh, sorry. No, go ahead. We can be on now, but I'm also, just so you know, from the time in to give everybody an extra 5 minutes.
Yeah, exactly.
5 more minutes, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. That's not on, is it? Good. Okay. Good morning. It is 11:10 or 11:08 or 11:07.5, depending on which clock you look at. I usually look at that one, so let's say it's 11:07.5. And we're reconvening. We'll now go back to the order of presentation. I'll go through it. These are the same, right? Okay. Given that we've given you some additional things to consider and give us feedback on, we're going to give an extra 5 minutes for each of the panels, not for the individual presentations that are 3 minutes, but for the panel. So that means here's our order, which hopefully you know already, but if not, it is, first we'll hear from the Central Coast Water Board, now for 20 minutes, Ocean Mist for 15. I'm not encouraging you to take all of your time, all of you. If you can do it within your allotted time, that is all. It gives you karmic bonus points because the more succinct you are, the better. But I also realize there may be more to say. So, Grower Shipper 15, Farm Bureau 15, Jensen 15, the Keepers 20, Environmental Justice Panel 20. Then we'll go to other interested persons. We're going to keep that at 3 minutes. And frankly, if there's a point that you want us to know, 3 minutes generally makes a more concise point than longer. And then for rebuttal, we'll have 3 minutes for each presenter of the formal presentation. So for the ones I mentioned that are the requested panels. And so with that, why don't we just commence with the Central Coast Water Board. Thank you for your patience. I hope the hour was productive for all of you, and we appreciate you taking the time to help us figure this out.
Good morning.
Now that should say 20.
Good morning, Chair Marcus and members of the board. My name is Angela Schroeder. I'm a senior engineering geologist at the Central Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board, and I manage the agricultural regulatory program. Effective implementation of the agricultural order is among our highest priorities, and we appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Our comments focus on 2 main points. First, we recommend that the State Board retain specific reporting requirements that are fundamental to effectively implementing the agricultural order, which I will address. Second, We have recommendations regarding the definition for compliance, which Francis McChesney will address. Regarding the first point, the reporting requirements. The regional board strongly agrees with the language in the state board's draft order to uphold the reporting of nitrogen applied for the subset of Tier 2 and Tier 3 farms that are high risk for loading nitrate to groundwater. Furthermore, we have reviewed and agree with the proposed late changes which reinstate and clarify the option to report nitrogen applied by risk unit. But we do want to make some clarifications. With respect to the specific language, there is a footnote on page 46 that states that the reporting requirement is for nitrogen content of fertilizer, not total pounds of fertilizer. And that footnote wasn't carried across, and so we just want to make sure that that's actually a global change in the order. Secondly, also on page 46, total nitrogen applied from irrigation water is stated to be reported as a concentration. We suggest that that be reported as total nitrogen in pounds, and that should be a global change for both methods 1 and methods 2. Thirdly, on page 46, method 1 for the total nitrogen applied reporting includes total nitrogen present in soil. There is no mention of soil in method 2, and so we just want to confirm that this was intentional. Finally, regarding the specific language, we request that the state board staff review the related language on page 57 and 59 in the annual compliance form, just to make sure it's consistent with these changes. However, we continue to disagree with the removal of other reporting requirements related to nutrient management for a subset of Tier 3 farms. We specifically recommend that the state board retain the following requirements in the agricultural order. The requirement for Tier 3 farms with high nitrate loading risk to determine and report the typical crop nitrogen uptake. This is in condition 74 and in the Tier 3 MRP. In addition, we also recommend that the state board retain the requirement for Tier 3 farms to calculate and report the annual balance of nitrogen applied per crop compared to the typical nitrogen crop uptake, otherwise known as the nutrient balance ratio. Without this fundamental information, the regional board cannot implement the program to achieve its stated purpose of reducing pollutant loading, improving water quality, and protecting drinking water. To underscore this point, the experts consistently recommended that documenting the reduction of nitrogen input to the production system and improved irrigation efficiency should be the focus of the ag order. I want to emphasize the word documenting. Experts consistently recommended that documenting the reduction of nitrogen input for the production system and improved irrigation should be the focus of the ag order. Experts further agreed that identifying how much nitrogen is needed and comparing that to the amount of nitrogen that is applied is a fundamental but critical necessity in preventing nitrate impacts to groundwater. Nutrient budgeting is a standard industry practice, and most growers report that they have already been implementing nutrient budgeting practices for many years. As we have previously discussed, the 2004 order required all growers to implement nutrient management practices. In response to required reporting for the 2004 order, 67% of growers indicated they know their crop nutrient requirements, and a similar percentage indicated they use nutrient budgets and keep records of nitrogen applied. And that's, again, described in Exhibit 23 of the admin record. Growers are already implementing these fundamental practices. The issue is then the reporting of the information. The reporting requirements create accountability and compel the highest risk farms to evaluate and change their practices to improve water quality. The requirement to report this information to the water board is not only basic and fundamental, it is reasonable, especially given the severe water quality conditions and impacts to drinking water sources and public health. The regional board worked with experts to develop the nutrient management requirements. Careful thought was given to the requirements to make them a scalable package that started off with minimal requirements for lower risk farms and increasing levels of implementation and reporting for for the higher risk farms. Since the initial version of the agricultural order was released in 2010, the nutrient management requirements have been slowly stripped away from this order in response to comments from the agricultural representatives and in negotiations. The nitrogen reporting for a subset of Tier 2 and Tier 3 farms are all that remain. Without these fundamental reporting requirements, the regional board will have no measure of progress or accountability toward reductions of nitrate loading into groundwater, which are critical to protect sources of drinking water and public health. We disagree with the comments that the state board should remove or delay these fundamental reporting requirements for the highest risk farms. The UC Davis nitrate report also recommends nitrogen reporting as a low-cost priority action. With respect to coalitions, we agree that the ag industry and technical assistance providers play an important role in helping growers in their efforts to improve water quality. However, it is also important to understand that many growers and some commodity groups in our region have told us they do not or may not want to be associated with a coalition, depending on costs and benefits. The regional board cannot dictate the concept of coalitions, but like the state board, the regional board does allow for and supports coalitions. The Central Coast Water Board is actively working with third-party groups, such as the California Strawberry Commission and others, to evaluate their role in helping growers to improve water quality, and we will continue to do so. Finally, it is important to realize that as the state board has been considering the petitions to the agricultural order over the past 18 months, the regional board and growers have been implementing it, and it is working. Many growers are in compliance with the order, and the regional board is already managing and reviewing information submitted for thousands of operations. Water quality conditions in the Central Coast region are severe, and the impacts to drinking water and public health are real. We encourage the state board to adopt the draft order without further delay. And now Frances McChesney will speak to the issue of defining compliance.
I just had 2 points. One regarding the compliance discussion on page 25 of the order. I just want to say that the regional board supports the changes and really appreciates the clarity that they provide to the regional board and the growers in complying with water quality standards. The regional board spent a lot of time working on this, and I think, and obviously the state board staff did too, and it really is a great improvement over what we had, so thank you.
Oh, good.
We also want to say that we oppose the changes proposed by the agricultural petitioners on these issues regarding compliance in their comments on the previous draft. The other comment I want to make is that as you know, the Water Code authorizes the regional boards to delegate authority to the executive officers, and there's some authority they can't delegate, but they can delegate other authority. And in the order, in a few places, it says the Central Coast Water Board will do something. And I'm assuming that you don't intend to change the legal authority of the regional board to delegate the authority to the executive officer, except as specifically noted in some areas. So, for example, on page 34, it has the provision that the Central Coast Water Board would approve the template.
Closer to the mic.
Sorry, the Central Coast Water Board would approve the template for providing the notification about exceedances in groundwater, and I'm assuming that that means the Central Coast Water Board can delegate that authority to the executive officer. Just wanted to confirm that that's the case.
That's just in the discussion also at this point, I think, and yes,
Right,
in that
yes,
case.
yes.
We might have to look at each instance, but did you
I
have
think
any
it's
other?
pretty obvious in the others where
Okay.
there's an intent to have it, the authority be the board itself, but I just wanted to confirm that where it's not specifically said, it's the normal legal standard. Okay, that's all I had.
Great, thank you. Questions?
The issue of that Angela brought up on how the regional board is going to make a judgment as to how much or how little or how effective the application of nitrates is, can you well, and maybe we should hear from the growers as to how they would advise the regional board, how they make those judgments. But from your own perspective, since you have made recommendations on changes as to what the regional board wanted in terms of percentages and other measures for judging appropriate amounts, how are they going to know what we've asked be provided is an appropriate amount?
So this is regarding whether we have a nitrate ratio reported or not, and the changes that we've recommended that remove that. So in essence, what we've provided for in our proposed change is that they have every piece of information they need to do the calculation on the regional board side. And so the question, I guess, if you boil it down to is, do you make the farmer do that calculation and then give you the number, or do you do the calculation on your side? So for instance, they were telling us what kind of crop they're growing. We have the ability to look at the same information the farmer looks at as to the expected amount of the ranges of which nitrogen application would be expected for those different types of crops from the literature, and that's going to change over time and stuff like that. So the way I envision it, they have that information that we're having reported, how much was put on the field, what's in the water, what's in the soil, and with a quick calculation could say, hey, you know, the nitrogen ratio reported for broccoli is a high number and a low number, run both those calculations and see whether it looks like the application on a particular reported amount was within the bounds that you would expect to see, or how it compares with everybody else. And so I believe they can do everything they do. What we were striving for was having the farmers report measured values, not both a value that they had to pick out of a number, and then, of course, the incentive that I saw was to pick high. And when you look at certain crops, the swing between the high and the low recommendation was as much as 40% of the value of the total applied. That's huge when you're getting to it. Well, if I want to drive my ratio that I report lower, I'm going to pick the highest value because it's going to show I've got a nice low ratio, regardless of whether that's what you should be doing or not. And so there was some feeling that it was simpler to have them report actual measured values, and then we can, on the backside, with the information, make assumptions about the applied amounts and guess for crops and stuff like that, and see how things start to fall out. And of course, this is all couched on the expectation that we're going to have an expert panel that's going to inform us further as to how to go here, and this is one of the issues that they will definitely address going forward. So that was kind of the basis for why we selected the information that we're asking for to be submitted.
Chair Marcus, could I clarify what our specific recommendation is? The draft order actually removes the requirement for the grower to determine and report the typical crop nitrogen uptake. So that's the basis for what that's their decision, reporting out on their decision of how they make their fertilizer decisions. And so without requiring the grower to even determine that, there's no basis for us to go to the grower and say, what's the number you're using for your nitrogen application. So in addition to the nutrient balance ratio that Darren's speaking of, we also recommended that the draft order require the grower to determine and report it out on the typical nitrogen crop uptake.
So, Angela, I'm flipping through this very fast to try to find it, but I believe we did delete provision 74, which is the reporting requirement, but they still have to put the number in the irrigation and nutrient management plan so that they have it. Let me just find the reference. Okay. So, 51.
I see it's letter D there. 51.
Identification of crop nitrogen uptake values for use in nutrient balance calculations. So we've kept the requirement that they identify it and record it in the INMP, but they no longer report it.
So our recommendation would be that they would include that in the reporting.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
You brought up that point about method 1 versus method 2 and the total nitrogen present in the soil in pounds per acre for each field. Darren, do you think that's something we should carry through to method 2, or why shouldn't we?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. So typically when you're aggregating over a longer time period, and this time period expressed by this would be the annual reporting. So all of the nitrogen applied to all the crops that have rotated through the field within the year. The assumption you generally make is that, to kind of simplify it a little bit, is that because you're going to have a stored value that you start with and you end with in all of those cycles, that you assume it goes to 0 for purposes of the calculation of the balance, because the swings are not usually dramatic enough to throw off your overall balance calculation. So it is an omission on purpose from the standpoint of when you calculate that out over a bunch of succeeding crops, the assumption is generally that what was stored in the soil is very similar to what was stored when you first started, and therefore in a balance ratio it's a 0 net effect.
Thank you.
Actually, before Angela sits back down, can I, the two very specific recommendations.
She doesn't have to stand back up before
you don't have to
answer.
stand
She
back up,
sat
but you
down
had
already.
two
But she can
very-
stand back up again if she wants to. You don't have to. Sorry, I was just trying to be clear that you have a lot of choice here.
Yeah. The two specific recommendations or edits you had identified, I think I caught one of them, but not the other. Do you mind going over those two again?
So the first one was on page 46. There's a footnote number 1.
Mm-hmm.
And it states that the reporting requirement is for nitrogen content of fertilizer, not total pounds of fertilizer. That footnote repeats in several sections of the draft orders. We just want to make sure it's a global change.
Well, I think this is this the one you're talking about right here?
Yeah,
Yeah.
applies.
Yeah, so what the proposed change would be is on the footnote 1, that's kind of near the middle of the page 46. It says this reporting requirement is for the nitrogen content of fertilizer, and then we would propose to say in pounds and not the total pounds of fertilizer, just for better clarity. Right. Okay.
And there was one more, right?
The second one was also on page 46. The total nitrogen applied from irrigation water, it's reported there as a concentration. Our recommendation is that it be reported as a mass, so total nitrogen in pounds. And that would be a global change for both methods in 1 and 2.
That's just knowing the concentration
C.
doesn't give you
Okay.
the mass.
And then finally, our last comment was there was some similar language in the annual compliance form on page 57 through 59. So just to make sure that that language is consistent.
Carries through. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And next, ocean mist. Mr. Thomas?
It's Bill Thomas speaking for Ocean Mist and R&C Farms, two of the large vegetable operations, Salinas, Watsonville, Pajaro Valleys. We certainly overall appreciate all the time that's been spent on this issue to try to get it right on the Central Coast, not just at this hearing and the most recent amendment, but your staff and you all, throughout this enterprise. Because of the recent amendments, and I'm one of those who just got them today, so I'll be totally confused here. I'll just hit.
It's actually just a test, that's the only reason.
It's just a test.
Just a test.
I'll just hit by category 2 or 3, maybe 4 or 5 actually, of the points that we've talked about. As to the amendments regarding the monitoring of drinking wells, we didn't have any objection how it was before, but you've greatly improved it by the amendments offered today. As far as reporting exceedances of nitrate in drinking wells, first, we highly support that it's focused on nitrate and not the 70 other elements that are MCLs that we've not talked at all about through any of the record. There is some dispute or confusion in the ag community over who actually makes the report to those individuals. And even from our standpoint, it should be the landlord, landowner, but the coalitions have been coordinating apparently, and there are some, growers that would rather have that notification to it'll usually be an employee of the ranch, come from the third party, so perhaps the lack of certainty here gives rise to flexibility. As far as reporting nitrogen use, even though we had preferred that would be in the farm plan, I guess it's still in the compliance document. We have no problem with reporting the nitrate use, and the amendments that you proffered in this draft provide flexibility to deal with a few of the head scratch items that we had and others had raised about double cropping, et cetera, et cetera. So you've greatly improved that section. I would speak to the nutrient management plan and the elements that had started with 4 elements. You had removed a couple of those. The nitrate risk level that had been referenced by Angela. We think that was a very thoughtful removal on your part because it added nothing except confusion and difficulty in trying to guess at what a risk would be. And Darren responded very appropriately on that point. There's even concern how the language that now regards that compels a farmer to do a calculation to determine crop nitrogen uptake. That's easier to talk about than it is. The plants taking up nutrients is a dynamic piece of biology mixed with chemistry. Certainly soil factors, fertility, pH, moisture, the electrostatic influences in the soil chemistry, microbial action, that's soil type stuff. On the crop side, the health, the vigor, the stage, so I'm not so sure that the right way to necessarily approach it is compelling all to do that calculus that they can't really do, but they'll give you a number. As maybe to also reference you could make some sort of reference to standard university data for that calculation. A continuing frustration on another point has to do with the terminology that you shall not cause or contribute to an exceedance. Certainly no problem with the word cause. By having the word contribute opens a whole new panoply. What if we're dealing with something that has a standard of 100 and it's already at 97 and you contribute 3 ppm? You're in violation because you've now contributed. It even gets more bizarre if you're already at 101 and you contribute 2 molecules, then you're the target of that enforcement.
Can you ever seen that? Have you ever seen that happen? Cause or contribute is not an unusual set of
it's
language.
It's not unusual.
And if you just go to cause, we get into the whole argument about smoking wasn't proved, the causal link between smoking and cancer wasn't proved till decades after we knew epidemiology. So you could have confusion or a challenge or an unreasonable result whether you use the language or not, but it seems more reasonable to keep the language we tend to use and then count on reasonableness and discretion, because people aren't out there trying to look for the 2-molecule issue. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just think you can argue that one any way you want.
I think you can, and I'm not arguing. I would not argue that it should just be cause, because that would give a defense to somebody that's a substantial contributor. And that shouldn't, be our result either. I'm searching
you can have havoc with cause. That's all I'm saying. Cause or contribute, there's a rule of reason that comes with it.
Well, I guess that was where I was going, Madam Chair. I don't think that contribute needs to be removed. I think a reasonable qualifier, significant, substantial, something, should be there, so we don't have to defend ourselves against a writ of mandate brought against the regional board for not enforcing against us for the very insignificant rule. We'll never be precise here, Madam Chair, as you recognized, but the legal structure for torts based on the reasonable man. So that's, I guess, what we're seeking some interpretive guidance on.
Well, I have a question, though.
Yes, you bet.
But putting that in context with the language in the order above the cause or contribute language on page 25, does that give you some relief in terms of dischargers must make a conscientious effort to identify and implement, putting it all into context about what's expected?
The language that you put your finger on, I think, does put it in context. The cause and contribute language shows up in about 4 or 5 different places. Some of it's been added in. So it isn't always with that context. But that context, certainly in that application, be helpful. My last point is to acknowledge some clarification that that we arrived at just before this hearing in respect to tile drains. Tile drains, as you are aware, are very important to our ocean mist. It is one of the most highly acclaimed reclamation of water situations. And it's been there a long time and has served as a model across the country, where we take cities' semi-treated water, we put it across vegetation, soils, and it goes out much cleaner than it comes in. We read the preceding language to require that you monitor on the farm down into the tile structure. I think the way that it is now amended in context, it is clear if those tile drains outfall, to waters of the state, that's then where it would be intercepted. I think that's reasonable, and apparently that isn't a change, but it clarifies in the language, and for that we are very grateful. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Grower shipper. I'm sorry, I'm just calling the clients or the categories. I should be looking at something else.
Not a problem. And
Probably
actually,
have names on the other piece of paper. So
I do have a PowerPoint, so if I can have, and then is there a clicker or something for me to use? I brought pictures.
Great. And introduce yourself, how you want to be.
Yes. Tess Dunham with Somac Simmons and Dunn here today on behalf of the Grower Shipper Association of Central California, the Grower Shipper Association of Santa Barbara and the San Luis Obispo counties, and Western Growers. And I think as I go through my PowerPoint, when I actually submitted, obviously prior to receiving last night's changes, I'll be able to address the changes based upon the comments as to where we stand as requested by the chairperson with respect to the changes that were made. So let's see if I can. Oh, is this little scrolly bar or the button? You guys.
Scrolly.
All right, I'm rolling, and it's not moving. All right, so let's try this. Okay, I'm scrolling. Okay. Yeah, it's not that long. So, okay, so first of all, go ahead, Courtney, thank you. So our general comments, this is just kind of an overview of some of the issues that we had put forward in our comment letter. And actually, you have addressed a number of the issues that we provided in our comments. So we'll go through and I'll talk about these in order. Go ahead, Courtney. First, we did talk a lot about, and the order touches upon, and there was, the sentence added as far as encouraging the Central Coast Board to look at a third-party program. And it is something that I think, the grower shippers and the Western growers believe is something we really do need to explore further within the Central Coast versus the individual tiered approach that currently exists, is to look something more at a third-party program where you have different levels of reporting based upon going through coalitions that can help facilitate and administrate the programs of these sizes. And I think I heard correctly, but I can't quite remember, and if I misquote you, Angela, I apologize in advance, that I think the comment may have been made that the state board can't dictate that the regional board create coalitions, but I guess I would say you as the state board actually have a fair amount of authority, and if you wanted to even adopt your own third-party order, you definitely have that authority to do so. So I think I would disagree a little bit perhaps with the authority of the State Water Board. And this is just I think we talked about it at the last workshop, so I won't repeat it here, but just talking about, how in the Valley programs, how it works to have a coalition with respect to reporting, especially on the issue of nitrogen management plans, which of course is an issue going on in the different expert panel and CDFA task force. So I'll go ahead and skip those and get into the, go ahead and skip the next one. And then so, we basically, our request was that you direct, not just encourage, and there was a sentence added for encourage, but you direct the Central Coast Board to really work with stakeholders to develop a long-term program that includes a third-party approach versus the individual approach that currently exists within the Central Coast. So then the next issue goes along with the electronic reporting of total nitrogen applied that was just discussed. And we do advocate that we think it is appropriate that at this point in time, considering the uncertainty, considering the processes that are in place, that with respect to total nitrogen reporting, that instead of having it in the annual compliance form that goes to the regional board, that it be retained in the farm plan. And we do appreciate the changes that have been made to include the method 2. With respect to not just a management block, but also on a high risk or a nitrate loading risk unit. And I'm going to explain a little bit why a management block reporting process is really problematic, especially in the Central Coast. So
appreciate the addition of method 2, but we would still advocate that at this point in time, instead of having this reported publicly on the annual compliance form, we still think it's appropriate to maintain this in the farm plan until we, in the state board and CDFA, figure out exactly how everything is going to be reported. So when we do start, we have consistency versus different regions doing different things. Go ahead. Okay, so talking about the block level, just, you know, why our comments and why we were so concerned by only having method 1 and why we think it's appropriate to have method 2 as well. It's really important to understand that Central Coast agriculture is so unique. And in fact, you will often have, you know, acres broken up into quarter acres, and that would be an independent management block. So when we started calculating out how this might affect growers, I mean, we were coming up with potentially thousands of different management blocks when you consider the number of crops, the 1.8 to 2.6 plantings per year, and it just absolutely made it overly burdensome. And then to figure that that goes into some type of an annual electronic compliance form was just really overwhelming. And I want to give some, here's where the pictures come in. So go ahead. Here's an example of kind of a typical management block. I mean, you have side by side a number of different types of crops, right, that may have different, some may stay in the ground for 35 to 40 days if it's like a spring mix. Lettuce might be, I think someone told me the numbers, like 60 days. Actually, I've got it here somewhere. But, you know, I mean, it's all over. And the white, just to point out, the white flowers that you see there, that's actually what they call a trap crop, and it's used for integrated pest management. And it's to have, you know, to basically provide beneficials to help with your IPM program so you avoid, obviously, using more pesticides. And that actually shows up as a potential management block as your whole IPM. And it's not a crop, you know, necessarily. It is part of your IPM program. So it kind of shows the diversity. And we've got some more pictures here. You know, here too is another example of some management blocks. These are probably, you know, 5 to 10 acre blocks, you know, but shows you how closely together and diverse in one ranch you might have different types of crops. And then there's another example, you know, with different spring mix lettuces, again, that some will stay in the ground for 30 to 45 days and then will be planted into something else that may have a longer time period. But again, you've got this residual diversity and variety that's changing all the time, which makes reporting information on a manageable block level extremely burdensome. I got some maps here too that I think just to show some diversity within, you know, the Central Coast this is basically a farm or a ranch. And this might be an example of how it gets divided amongst the different crops into the different acreages. And even though some of these will say, you know, broccoli, and several of them will say broccoli, that broccoli is probably staggered. It's been planted at different times, which means it's probably being irrigated slightly differently. It's being fertilized slightly differently because it's been staggered in plantings. And it just, again, is an example. I mean, you've got mixed lettuce, and you've got cauliflower, and you've got romaine, and you've got romaine hearts to be distinguished, right? And we stagger because we all like our salads 365 days a year. Except maybe on Thanksgiving, which there's far too many good potatoes in order to have salad. So, and it just as you go through, and then on the second map here, it does show like broccoli, but again, this broccoli is staggered. So each one has to be considered a different management block, and you can't consider it as just one broccoli unit if we were required to report under the method 1, which is the management block unit. And then we go to ranch map 3. Oh, here it is. So head lettuce is like 65 to 120 days. Spring mix is 25 to 35 days. Strawberries, 14 months. I mean, in here in this map, you can see you've got strawberries, you've got cauliflower, you've got lettuce, and the blocks change throughout the year. And the last one I'll show is just go to ranch map 5, Courtney. And just to, again, show you how complex a growing operation in the Central Coast could be, that this is one ranch, and look at all the different types of crops that they have on one ranch and all the different blocks that they have to manage. So again, just examples of the complexity. You know, I'm from the Sacramento Valley, and we have rice, and so it's one big rice field, right? And it took me a long time to understand just how different growing in the Central Coast is, and it's nothing like what we really do in the Valley. So then going into the groundwater monitoring, you know, we have argued and continue to advocate, and we'll have some technical comments provided, that in the original or the August 20th version, there was a requirement for the cooperative monitoring program to monitor all domestic supply wells. We support the changes that have been provided in the draft that came out yesterday that basically allows for statistical analysis to characterize aquifers. In that, and as you will hear from a hydrogeologist versus a lawyer, you don't need to monitor every well in order to characterize the drinking water. And in fact, there are methods and ways to do it. So we support the change that has been made. We also support the changes to eliminate the notification requirements for primary and secondary MCLs. You know, one, it's this program, or the concern is with respect to nitrate. Monitoring for all primary and secondary MCLs would make a program cost prohibitive. Plus, they're not all related to agricultural inputs, and so it would be questionable how they even be related to an agricultural discharge program. And of course, the secondary MCLs, as you all know, they're not public health standards, they're taste and odor standards. They're, you know, for iron, so our laundry doesn't turn red, but they're not public health issues. With respect, go ahead, thanks, Courtney. With respect to the changes on containment structures, we don't agree with the order as it is. There was a change early on to go from avoid to minimize, and we support maintaining the word minimize versus avoid. We are concerned, and especially in light of, you're going to hear, you know, Francis and I think the one thing that you can always be certain is when it comes to compliance with water quality standards, Francis and I are probably always on the opposite sides. So when you consider the compliance with the water quality standards provisions and the fact that the containment structure provision basically says you have to avoid discharge of waste, it really does set up, I think, agriculture to question whether they should maintain containment structures. If we can't show that a containment structure isn't going to discharge that exceeds a water quality standard, we subject ourselves to potential enforcement. And I think that would be really sad, because we all know that containment structures in of themselves are valuable management, you know, best management practices, right? They help control sediment to protect surface water. And if we're trying to discourage the use of containment structures, you know, this is where we often run, where our surface water and our groundwater run afoul of each other. You know, which one is more important? Well, they're both equally important. And we need to figure out how we can still utilize containment structures. You know, and we spent a lot of time during the stay hearing talking about cost associated with lining of such structures in the Central Coast that, you know, if the requirement is to line them, I think people are just going to not be able to use them. And I think, do we really want that to be the result with respect to protection of our surface waters, not to be able to filter sediment?
I have a question on that one.
Yes.
What do you think of the language, again, not in the Central Coast order, but in ours, at page 26. We retain the word avoid in the provision because we disagree that requiring the avoidance of percolation of waste to groundwater constitutes a prohibition on all percolation of water to groundwater. And further, because the specific compliance options added to the provision make it sufficiently clear that dischargers may comply with the provision through measures that avoid the discharge of waste, yet continue to allow percolation of water.
Yeah, I still think it's a problem. I think that I understand, and I think, you know, that the language added tries to put some contextual, you know, discussion with around the point, but the language of the order is avoid. You have to avoid the percolation of waste in order to be compliant with the terms of the order. And, you know, perhaps I can rely on a precedential order as with respect to interpreting what the term avoid means in this context, but at the end of the day, the order as written, and we all know a court's going to look to the four corners of the permit, it says you have to avoid. And which means if I'm not avoiding waste going out of the containment structure, have I violated that provision? I think I probably have, or at least it could be argued that I have violated the provision if I haven't avoided the percolation of waste.
I don't know if it's okay with it, but I'd like to hear from staff on that. Yeah.
Well, I think Phil Wiles, just as a general statement about the concern about enforcement, it's probably worth pointing out that this is not NPDES Clean Water Act permitting that we're talking about here. And so it really is enforcement by the regional board that people might be concerned about. There is other discussion if the concern is about whether it requires lining. In the order here itself, we do recite that the Central Coast Board says that they don't intend this language to require anybody to line their ponds, their containment structures. I think absolutely the regional board's going to have to be very cognizant of what the state board says in the order before it about exactly how to enforce provisions related to containment structures and whether or not it really does require lining. Again, what kind of efforts by the dischargers are expected to be taken to comply. There are also the examples that are actually in the order itself that we're proposing the state board add, which are on the top of page 27, examples of how to comply with the provision. So in toto, I think that we're making it pretty clear that lining is absolutely not required, and in fact, we're giving specific instructions about how people could go about complying.
Where's the provision in the Central Coast Order that says that lining will not be required?
What I was referring to is on page 26
Mm-hmm.
in
The
our
options.
discussion. Not in the Central Coast Order itself, but in our discussion.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, yeah.
But that's language that will go directly in the Central Coast Order. It's not discussion in our order, it's actual revisions to the text of their order.
Mm-hmm.
So, agree to disagree, I guess, so to speak. But I mean, yes, there are some specific examples of other things that one might implement to avoid percolation of waste. But, you don't know as a grower, does implementing the chemical treatment truly, is that going to, be able to allow me to avoid that percolation of waste? Perhaps the water, quality of the water, and maybe it has nothing to do with my fertilization practices, but maybe it's the water that I use for irrigation is high in nitrate to the extent that by the time it gets to the containment structure, it's still high in nitrate. And so who knows, and I've heard different things about wood chips. I won't talk about the efficacy of some of these practices because I'm just not qualified to do so. But I think then when we go in, and I think we can talk and relate this and connect it to the water quality standards issue. Thanks, Courtney. I think this is where has been a long-standing disagreement between the regional board. Of course, this is an attorney issue, right? This is where we attorneys, love to get involved is these types of issues.
Well, you also have to live in the worst case scenario.
Yes. Well, and to that point, I appreciate Mr. Wiles reminding all of us that there are no citizen suit provisions within, Port Cologne, and therefore it really as necessary as it would be in an NPDES permit. But, unfortunately, I think it is, because these are still orders, they're quasi-judicial, they're still enforceable, and even though, any action to enforce the order would be against the regional board, if I'm the real party in interest, I'm still impacted regardless. Even though the citizen suit may not be against me directly, I'm still ultimately potentially subject to enforcement from the regional board, and we all know your discretionary enforcement authority is not without a hammer and can result in significant fines. And in fact, we are seeing increased enforcement in the ag programs and in groundwater quality context. So I don't find a lot of comfort in permit language that basically says we'll use our discretion with enforcement to determine whether we're going to deem you to be in compliance because you've implemented a management practice. Without specific language, I mean, not trying to do an ex parte here, we end up in the stormwater receiving water limitations quandary we're currently in. If we aren't careful with the language, we do end up with court decisions that end up saying, well, sorry, the language is what it is, and it says that you must comply or shall not contribute or cause or contribute to a violation of a water quality standard. And there's nothing specific in the language that says that as long as you are implementing a management practice, you're deemed in compliance. So we did propose some specific language that tries to provide the clarifications. And this is the language I believe Frances was referring to when she said that she opposed it. And, it gets to when we talk about the cause or contribute language in provision 22, if we don't make the connection that is accept as provided in and clearly state that someone is being found in compliance for implementing management practices, we are left with the fact that water quality standards are enforceable on day one, and you're totally up to the discretionary enforcement of the regional board. You know, there are time schedules and milestones and tables, but there are no specific time schedule provisions for meeting water quality standards in this permit. And again, I feel like I get on my soapbox on this issue every time I come before this board, but I just see it so crucial because I've seen how it plays out in the other permit world, in the other permit context. You know, in looking at the regional board comments, they said, well, no other program does this. You know, you got to, meet them, and it's all used for discretionary enforcement. But I think we need to keep in context that the POTW program didn't really start including water quality-based effluent limits into permits until, the TMDL litigation in the late 90s and the onset of the SIP in 2000. And since then, they've had compliance schedules both in the CTR and in the state board's compliance schedule policy. With agriculture, we've just started in our regulatory program in 2000. We haven't been around for the 30 years or 40 years that the POTW program is. But there's an expectation that we should be meeting water quality standards today. We can't. There's probably some we can meet. There's probably in different management practices or different commodities. But at the end of the day, based upon current knowledge and current information, we cannot guarantee that even the best agricultural operation can comply with water quality standards for water that's either percolating or leaving the field. And if we want to retain agriculture in California and allow us to provide and to develop those tools, we have to be able to work and have, whether it's time schedules or something as a deemed compliance, as long as we are implementing best management practices. I can't say it any clearer than that. I mean, I just, trying to be honest up here, we just can't, in the agricultural systems, they're dynamic, and the way that they work and their non-point source, we can't guarantee for all constituents and all pollutants that we can meet water quality standards today. So those are why we have put forward these changes that we think our modest changes help to provide clarifications that if you're implementing management practices, you would be found in compliance with water quality standards.
Are you saying that you can't, because of source water issues, because of existing groundwater or soil contamination, because your practices? Are you saying that it's the practices, the current practices, that won't meet water quality standards either? So it's not just source water, it's not just soils.
I think it's the latter, Fran, and from what we know, right, again, this is still also, we don't have necessarily in all cases, we don't have enough information to know which practices are the most effective at which point in time and which ones will ultimately water quality standards. Especially in the groundwater context, there is, starting afoot, a great number of studies and work to be done to evaluate practices and to evaluate water underneath the root zone to see what can we meet if you implement that practice. But we don't know now if doing X practice means that your discharge into the root zone is going to comply with Z water quality standard. We don't have that connection of information in order to make a guarantee. So we're all kind of guessing in the dark, that even the grower that uses the best practices, for some commodities they may, but in order to maintain an appropriate